Men rescues trapped bear. What the bear does next will shock you. The biting chill of Montana's wilderness wrapped itself around Jack Harper as he trudged through the dense forest, his boots crunching through layers of crusted snow. At 75, Jack moved slower than he once did, his frame slightly stooped, but his hands were still steady. Weathered from decades of woodworking and laboring under open skies, the solitude of the Absaroka Beartooth Wilderness suited him. It had been his refuge since Margaret, his wife of 45 years, passed away. 3 winters ago, their cabin, nestled between towering pines and overlooking a small, icy creek, was a place of quiet reflection, filled with a scent of sawdust and the faint echoes of memories he wasn't quite ready to let go. Jack's days were marked by routine chopping wood for the stove, carving intricate patterns into reclaimed timber for furniture, and walking the trails that WW through the forest like veins. It was during one such walk late in the afternoon that a low, guttural sound pierced the stillness. Jack froze mid-step, the axe slung over his shoulder momentarily forgotten. The growl carried a note of pain reverberating through the trees. He scanned the area, squinting against the grey light filtering through the bare branches. The sound came again, a raw mix of a growl and a whimper. Jack's heart thudded. He knew what it was. He'd spent enough time in these woods to recognize the cry of a bear. Caution tempered his curiosity as he tightened his grip on the axe handle, moving carefully. Jack followed the sound, his boots leaving deliberate imprints in the snow. The forest, once tranquil, seemed to pulse with tension, the distant calls of crows providing an eerie soundtrack to his search. It wasn't long before he came upon the source, a large black bear lying partially obscured by brush. Her massive frame rose and fell in uneven breaths, her dark eyes locked onto him with a mixture of defiance and desperation. Jack's gaze dropped to her front leg, and his stomach clenched. The bear's paw was clamped in the jagged metal teeth of a steel trap, blood seeping into the snow beneath her. She snarled weakly as he approached, her muscles trembling with pain and exhaustion. For a moment, every survival instinct Jack had screamed at him to turn back. Yet something about the bear's vulnerability kept him rooted in place. He'd seen injured animals before, elk with broken antlers, foxes limping through frost, but this was different. There was an intelligence in her eyes, a flicker of understanding that tempered the wild fury he expected. Jack spoke softly, his voice calm, despite the knot forming in his chest. "I'm not here to hurt you, girl. Let's figure this out together." The bear growled again, but didn't move to lunge. Her strength clearly sapped. Jack took a tentative step closer, keeping his movements deliberate and his voice low from his satchel. Jack pulled out the small loaf of bread he'd baked that morning. He tore off a piece, tossing it gently toward the bear. She sniffed the offering, her nostrils flaring as hunger momentarily overrode her pain. Jack tossed another piece, then knelt a few feet away, assessing the trap. It was old, rusted, and cruelly efficient, its jagged edges biting deep into her flesh. He swallowed hard, wiping his palms on his coat before gripping a sturdy stick, using the stick as a lever. He wedged it beneath the trap's release mechanism, his hands trembling as he applied pressure. The trap resisted, groaning under the strain, and Jack's breath came in sharp bursts visible in the icy air. Finally, with a metallic snap, the trap's jaws released their grip. The bear withdrew her injured paw with a sharp intake of breath, retreating a few steps but not running. Jack stayed crouched, his body taut, waiting for her next move. She stared at him, her dark eyes still watchful, but no longer. Wild blood dripped from her paw onto the snow, and Jack resisted the urge to reach for her, knowing it would break the fragile trust forming between them. After a long moment, the bear turned and limped into the trees, her silhouette disappearing into the twilight. Jack exhaled a shack breath, sinking onto a nearby log, his limbs trembling with the adrenaline of the encounter as the forest settled back into its familiar rhythm. Jack rose and made his way home. The walk felt longer than usual. each step weighed down by the memory of the bear's eyes and the unspoken connection they'd shared back at his cabin. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, but the heat did little to soothe Jack's restless mind. He replayed the moment over and over: the trap, the bear's growls, the silent understanding that passed between them. Something about it felt significant, though he couldn't yet articulate why. That night, as the wind howled softly against the cabin's wooden walls, Jack lay awake, the bear's eyes lingering in his thoughts like a quiet plea for compassion. He hadn't realized he was capable of answering. The days after Jack Harper's encounter with the bear passed in a strange rhythm. The quiet of his cabin once, a comfort, now seemed charged with an expectant energy he couldn't quite explain. He spent his mornings as usual, chopping wood, tending to his small vegetable garden, and working on a rocking chair he had promised to a neighbor last spring. But his thoughts frequently strayed to the forest, to the bear he had freed, and to the way her eyes had seemed to linger on him. Before she disappeared into the trees, he told himself it was unlikely he would ever see her again. But the memory of her dark, watchful gaze remained vivid, refusing to fade into the ordinary haze of past passing days. It was during one of these mornings, as Jack worked on the rocking chair in his workshop, that he heard it, a deep, guttural sound carried faintly on the crisp winter air. He paused, his chisel hovering above the smooth curve of wood, straining to listen. The sound came again, low and resonant, unmistakably a bear's growl. Jack sat down his tools, wiping his hands on his flannel shirt as he stepped outside. The sunlight was pale, filtering weakly through the skeletal branches of the pines, and a chill breeze swept through the clearing. Jack scanned the tree line, his pulse quickening when he spotted movement emerging cautiously from the shadows. Was the black bear, her powerful frame limping slightly as she approached, but this time she wasn't alone. Two smaller shapes flanked her, their movements hesitant and curious. Cubs. Jack blinked, stunned. They were smaller than he would have expected, their fur thick and scruffy, one nearly jet black back, while the other had a faint brownish tint around its ears. And paws. The mother bear paused at the edge of the clearing, her injured paw raised slightly off the ground, her cubs pressing close to her sides. Jack's heart thudded as he took a step forward, his breath misting in the air. The bear growled softly, not a warning, but a sound that seemed more like a statement. She lowered her head into Jack's utter disbelief. She dropped something onto the ground. It gleamed faintly in the sunlight. A fish freshly caught and still glistening with water. Jack let out a soft, incredulous laugh, his voice unsteady. "You've got to be kidding me." The bear watched him, her massive head tilting slightly, as though gauging his reaction. Her cubs shifted nervously, their small bodies tensing with each twitch of her ears. Jack approached slowly, his boots crunching in the snow, and stopped a few feet away from the fish. He crouched, his movements deliberate, his voice low. "You brought this for me?" He didn't expect an answer, of course, but the question felt natural. The bear didn't move, her dark eyes steady on his. Jack picked up the fish, its cold, slippery texture grounding him in. The surreal moment, he held it up slightly in a gesture of gratitude, then stepped back to allow the bear, her space. The cubs, emboldened by his retreat, began to sniff around the clearing, their stubby legs awkwardly navigating the uneven snow. One cub stumbled over a small log, letting out a surprised yelp before scrambling to its feet. Jack chuckled, the sound warm and unbidden, and to his amazement the mother bear seemed to relax slightly. She let out a low huff, nudging the clumsier coop gently with her nose before turning her gaze back to Jack. He stood still, unsure of what to do next, until the bear took a slow step backward, then another, her cubs following her lead. Jack watched as they disappeared into the forest, their shapes melting into the shadows as seamlessly as they had appeared. For a long moment, Jack stood there, the fish still in his hands, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He knew animals exhibited intelligence. He had watched ravens solve puzzles and deer navigate obstacles. But this was something else entirely. The bear had remembered, sought him out, and offered a gesture of gratitude that felt almost human. It was humbling and settling, in equal measure, a reminder of how little he truly understood about the creatures he shared. This wilderness with that evening. Jack prepared the fish for dinner, feeling a twinge of guilt as he cooked it over the wood stove. He wasn't sure if it was because the fish felt like a gift too sacred to consume, or because it served as a tangible reminder of the connection he had forged with the bear. Either way, the meal tasted different, richer somehow, as though the forest itself had offered him a share of its bounty after eating Jack. Sat by the fire, his thoughts drifting back to the clearing in the cub's tentative exploration, he felt a strange pang of longing, a desire to see them again, to understand more about their lives and the bond they shared with their mother. It was foolish, perhaps, to grow attached to wild animals, but the thought refused to leave him over the next few days. Jack found himself looking out toward the tree line. More often scanning the shadows for any sign of movement, he began leaving small offerings at the edge of the clearing. Apples, nuts, and occasionally scraps of bread he had baked. He wasn't sure if the bear would return, but something in him needed to make the gesture. It felt like an acknowledgement, a way of saying, "I see you. I respect you." At first the offerings went untouched, the snow around them undisturbed, but one morning Jack noticed faint paw prints leading to the pile, and the food was gone. He smiled to himself, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. As the days turned into weeks, the visits became more regular. The mother bear, whom Jack began calling Maddie, would sometimes appear at the edge of the clearing, her cubs trailing behind her. They never ventured too close, but Jack didn't mind. He spoke to them softly, his voice carrying across the still air, and watched as the cubs grew bolder, darting a few steps forward before retreating to their mother's side. Maddie, for her part, seemed to tolerate his presence, her massive frame radiating a calm strength that Jack found both awe-inspiring and oddly reassuring in those moments surrounded by the quiet beauty of the forest and the unexpected company of his wild neighbors. Jack felt a sense of connection. He hadn't known he needed the grief that had clung to him. Since Margaret's passing began to loosen its hold, replaced by a fragile but growing hope life, he realized had a way of surprising you when you least expected it, weaving threads of meaning through even the quietest corners of existence. For the first time in years, Jack found himself looking forward to what the next day might bring, and the thought filled him with a warmth that rivaled even the coziest fire. The wind howled around Jack Harper's cabin, shaking its wooden walls and rattling the windows as the first signs of a fierce storm descended upon the Montana wilderness, the sky heavy with an ominous gray pressed down on the treetops as snow fell in relentless sheets, quickly blanketing the forest in a smothering layer of white inside. Jack stoked the wood stove, feeding it another log, as the flames crackled and threw dancing shadows across the room. He was no stranger to winter storms. They were a part of life out here, their isolation both a challenge and a comfort. But tonight something felt different, a tension in the air that he couldn't quite place. Perhaps it was his anticipation of seeing Maddie again, her visits now as much a part of his days as his morning coffee. He shook the thought away, pulling a quilt over his legs as he settled into his armchair. The storm intensified as darkness swallowed the cabin. Snow battered the windows with increasing ferocity, and the wind howled like a living thing, its cries echoing through the trees. Jack had just begun to doze when a sudden sound jolted him awake, a frantic scratching at the door, urgent and insistent, cutting through the storm's fury. His heart leapt for a moment. He thought it might be the wind playing tricks on his ears, but then it came again. More desperate this time, throwing off the quilt, Jack rose, his pulse quickening as he approached the door. He pulled it open, and the icy wind slammed into him, stinging his face and stealing his breath. Standing in the swirling snow was Maddie, her massive frame coated in frost, her dark fur matted with ice. Her growls were low and guttural, her eyes sharp with urgency as she pawed at the ground and glanced back into the storm. Jack barely had time to process the sight before she growled again, stepping back as if urging him to follow. "What is it, girl?" Jack shouted over the wind, his voice muffled by the roaring blizzard. Maddie didn't wait for him to decide. She turned and began to limp into the forest, her gait uneven, but determined, her head swinging back to ensure he was following Jack. Hesitated only a moment before grabbing his coat hat and flashlight. He slung the beam across the clearing and then stepped into the storm, the cold slicing through his layers with a vicious precision. Mattie led him deeper into the woods, her silhouette a dark blur against the unrelenting snow. The wind tore through the trees, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the muffled creak of branches bending under the weight of ice. Jack stumbled as the snow deepened, each step a struggle as it dragged at his boots and numbed his legs. His flashlight beam danced wildly, barely piercing the storms. Fury, but Empty Eye's figure remained steadfast ahead, her growls urging him on. Jack's breaths came in sharp, visible bursts, his lungs burning with the effort, but he pushed forward, trusting her completely. Time seemed to stretch as they trudged through the storm, the forest, an endless maze of white and shadow. Just as Jack began to doubt his strength to continue, Mattie stopped abruptly, turning to face him. She let out a sharp, insistent bark before leading him off the faint path and into a small hollow where the storm seemed slightly less oppressive. At first, Jack saw nothing, his flashlight's beam bouncing off the snow in chaotic flashes, but then he heard it, faint cries, thin and desperate, carried to him on the wind. He swept the light toward the sound, and his heart nearly stopped. Two small figures, huddled beneath a crude shelter of branches, their forms barely visible under the layer of snow that had begun to bury them. A boy and a girl, their faces pale and their bodies trembling uncontrollably, clung to each other in a fragile heap. Jack moved quickly, his instincts overriding his shock. "It's okay," he called out, his voice shaking as he dropped to his knees beside them. The girl looked up first, her wide eyes glassy with fear and exhaustion. The boy remained limp, his head resting on her shoulder. Jack shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around both children as he pulled them closer. "I've got you now, you're going to be all right." Mattie hovered nearby, pacing anxiously as her deep breath sent clouds of steam into the frozen air. Jack spared her a quick glance, his gratitude wordless but palpable, before turning his attention back to the children. Their small bodies were like ice, their clothes soaked through and inadequate for the brutal cold. The girl tried to speak, but her teeth chattered so violently that her words were incomprehensible. "Save your strength," Jack murmured, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll get you warm soon." He lifted the boy first, cradling him against his chest before coaxing the girl to her feet. She stumbled, but Jack steadied her with a strong hand, his arm around her shoulders as he guided them back toward the faint path. The return journey was a blur of exhaustion and determination. Jack's muscles burned with the effort of carrying the boy while supporting the girl, stumbling steps. Maddie walked along beside them, her presence a silent reassurance. Several times Jack felt the urge to stop to rest, but the children's faint cries spurred him onward. Finally, the faint glow of his cabin's windows emerged through the storm, a beacon of hope in the unrelenting wilderness. Jack nearly sobbed with relief as he reached the porch, kicking the door open and ushering them inside. The cabin's warmth was immediate, the crackling fire casting golden light over the scene as Jack set the boy down on a pile of blankets by the hearth. The girl collapsed beside him, her small hands clutching at the fabric of the coat Jack had wrapped around them. He worked quickly, fetching dry towels and wrapping them in blankets, then heating a kettle of water for tea. Maddie lingered by the door, her massive frame silhouetted against the firelight as she watched the children intently. Jack turned to her, his voice hoarse, but full of gratitude. "You did. Good girl, real good." As the children warned Med, their color began to return, and the girl managed to croak a few words. "Sophie," she whispered, pointing weakly to herself, before nodding toward the boy. "Ben, my brother Jack," nodded, his heart twisting at the thought of how close they had come to being lost forever. "Sophie and Ben," he said softly, his hand brushing the boy's damp hair. "You're safe now. Rests." Sophie's lips trembled into the faintest of smiles before her eyes fluttered shut. Jack turned back to Maddie, who had finally stepped inside, shaking snow from her fur in heavy clumps. She huffed softly, her dark eyes meeting Jack's with an unmistakable sense of shared understanding. He knelt before her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "I don't know how you found them," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "but you saved their lives tonight." Maddie let out a low rumble, her head dipping slightly, as if acknowledging his words in that moment. Jack felt something profound settle in his chest, a connection not just to this remarkable bear, but to the untamed beauty and resilience of the wilderness itself, the blizzard that had raged through the Montana. Wilderness was a memory now leaving a sparkling world of white in its wake. The sun, pale but persistent, hung low over the forest as Jack Harper stood on his cabin's porch, gazing out at the stillness that followed the storm inside. The cabin bustled with new life. Sophie and Ben, the children Maddie had led him to during that harrowing night, were bundled in thick quilts near the fire, their laughter finally beginning to replace the shivering silence they had carried when Jack first brought them in. The siblings had warmed quickly, their strength returning with every bowl of broth Jack set before them, and every kind word he offered. Their gratitude was as quiet as it was profound, communicated through shy smiles and hesitant nods. Yet it was Maddie, the mother bear, who remained foremost in Jack's mind. She had not lingered long after the storm, retreating to the forest, once she was sure the children were safe. Jack hadn't seen her since, but he knew that her absence was temporary. She had a way of appearing when he least expected it, and somehow he felt certain that their bond was unbroken. The news of the rescue spread, quickly carried to the nearest town by a ranger Jack had contacted to reunite the children with their family. Sophie and Ben had wandered from their family's cabin while their parents were distracted by preparations for the storm. When they didn't return, their parents had alerted the authorities. But the search was called off as the storm worsened. That Maddie had found them in such a vast, unforgiving wilderness and led Jack to their hiding place seemed to many in town like an act of divine providence. For Jack, it was something simpler, yet no less miraculous, a bond formed between two living creatures, an unspoken understanding that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. The townsfolk, intrigued by the story of Mattie's role in the rescue, began to visit Jack's cabin in small groups. Parents brought their children, young faces light with curiosity and wonder, while older residents listened intently, their weathered features softening. As Jack recounted the bear's quiet heroism, Jack was not used to such attention, having spent most of his life in solitude, but he welcomed it. Sharing the story felt like paying tribute to Maddie, a way of ensuring that the depth of her actions was not forgotten. The children in particular seemed enthralled, their imaginations captivated by the idea of a bear who saved lives and returned acts of kindness. "Will she come back?" one small boy asked one day, his voice brimming with hope. Jack smiled, his eyes drifting toward the tree line. "If she does, it'll be on her own terms. She's a wild thing, not ours to hold on to, but she'll always be a part of this place." It wasn't long before the story reached beyond the boundaries of their small community. A journalist from the state newspaper arrived at Jack's door, one crisp morning, notebook in hand, and a camera slung over her shoulder. She listened carefully as Jack spoke, her pen flying across the page, as he described Mattie's first appearance, the moments of trust that had grown between them, and the blizzard night that had brought them closer than ever. Her article, published a week later, painted a vivid picture of the bond between man and bear. And the story struck a chord with readers. Letters began arriving at Jack's cabin, handwritten notes from strangers who had read about Maddie and been moved by her actions. Some shared their own encounters with wildlife, while others simply wrote to thank Jack for reminding them of the connection humans could have with the natural world. Jack read each letter carefully, his hands trembling slightly at the weight of their words. It was humbling to know that his quiet life, so far removed from the noise of the wider world, had resonated with so many people. As winter gave way to spring, the community decided to honor Mattie's story in a way that would leave a lasting impact. A group of residents approached Jack with the idea of hosting a festival, one that would celebrate not only Mattie's heroism, but also the importance of coexistence with wildlife. At first, Jack hesitated. He had never been one for grand gestures or public events, preferring during the solitude of his cabin in the steady rhythm of his days. But as he listened to their plans, a gathering that would include educational talks, art displays, and fundraising efforts for local conservation initiatives, he found himself nodding. If it helps people understand how important it is to respect and protect what's out there, he said, then it's worth doing. The first annual Mountain Spirit Festival was held in late summer, its name chosen to reflect the all-inspiring presence of Maddie in the wilderness she called home. The festival was a modest affair by design, held in the town square under strings of lights and colorful banners. Jack was surprised by how many people attended, some traveling from neighboring states to take part. There were stalls selling handmade goods, a small stage for speakers, and a photo exhibit featuring snapshots of Montana's breathtaking landscapes. In its diverse wildlife, Jack himself was asked to speak, and though public speaking was far from his comfort zone, he agreed. Read standing on the stage, the afternoon sun warm on his face, he gazed out at the crowd and took a deep breath. When I first saw Maddie, he began, she was in pain, caught in a trap meant to harm her. I could have walked away, but something stopped me. I think it was her eyes that didn't just see me as a man, but as a part of this world, like she is. What she did that night, leading me to those children, wasn't just an act of instinct, it was an act of connection. A reminder that we're not so different from the creatures we share this land with. We both want to survive, to protect what we love, and if we can remember that, maybe we can learn to live side by side. The applause that followed was overwhelming, but what stayed with Jack most were the conversations he had afterward. Parents approached him with their children, thanking him for inspiring them to teach the next generation about conservation. A young artist presented him with a painting of Maddie and her cubs, their forms rendered in sweeping, vibrant strokes that seemed alive. Jack accepted it with a quiet smile, his heart full in a way it hadn't been in years. As the seasons turned, Mattie's visits became less frequent. Jack assumed her cubs had grown and moved on, venturing into new territories as they began their own lives. Yet he never stopped watching the tree line, hoping for a glimpse of her unmistakable silhouette on quiet evenings, as the sun set behind the mountains and bathed the cabin in golden light. Jack would sit on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and think of her. She had changed his life in ways he could never have imagined, filling the space left by grief with something profound and enduring. When Jack passed away many years later, the community came together to create a lasting tribute, a grove of aspens planted near his cabin named Harper's Refuge. It became a sanctuary for both people and wildlife, a place where visitors could reflect on the power of kindness and the fragile beauty of the natural world. And though Mattie's footprints had long since faded from the snow, her spirit remained in every rustle of leaves and every whisper of wind, a testament to the bond she had shared with the man who saw her not as a threat, but as a kindred soul.